if we can't persuade the majority of people that they need real change really quite soon, none of that tech is going to really matter that much. And so I think it is a people problem, and the failures have mostly been self-inflicted. And so I would say, if you talk to people in any form about the climate, take a step back and say, am I actually doing this the most effective way possible, or am I doing this in a way that's going to appeal to other people who already like me?
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Climate Confident Podcast. My name is Tom Raftery, and with me on the show today, I have my special guest, Ollie. Ollie, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, and thank you for having me on, Tom. So I'm Ollie Burch. I'm a communication strategist. I'm co-founder of a small agency in London called Money Equals that does a range of things, including sustainability communications. But I'm also communications nerds, and I came into communications because I was disappointed with the way that the climate movement was promoting itself, and then I sort of stayed in communications, which I didn't really expect to do necessarily. And the last 4.5 years since we started the agency, I've kind of been focused on the day-to-day of running a business and servicing our clients, and I haven't really engaged that much with the climate movement. But recently, I sort of stuck my head back above the parapet, and I sort of thought things would have moved on a lot, and that climate comms would have progressed from sort of 4.5 years ago, and it really hasn't. And so I'm an agency sort of co-founder and communication strategist, but I'm also just sort of annoyed person who cares about climate change and wants it to be communicated better, if that makes sense.
Sure. And how did you get into communications, and what was the pathway to your setting up Among Equals?
So originally I did a degree in behavioural and environmental biology. I was fascinated by that sort of interaction between creatures and people and planet. And then I did a further degree in environmental economics and policy. I really thought that would be the way I was going. And then I met someone who said, oh, have you thought about sustainability communications, which I didn't even know was a thing. I'd been interested in the climate movement, and I'd done some writing, and I was sort of annoyed by, at that time, it felt like the climate movement wasn't really engaging business significantly. We're talking about a while ago now. And so I sort of, I'm going to be in climate, but I'm going to wear a suit and I'm going to work for a big business, and I'm going to try and do something from there. And so I went to work for a big global ad agency that had a brand new sort of specialist sustainability team. And I worked there for a while, and then through various agencies, and got a little bit frustrated with how other agencies were. And when a really good friend of mine and former colleague reached out and said, hey, let's start an agency during the pandemic, I said yes. And actually it was the perfect time because no one cared that we didn't have an office. It was just like 2 or 3 of us working from our bedrooms. And now we've got an office and a team and all of the sort of things that people expect. But it was actually the sort of perfect time to do that. And climate communications has never been 100% of what I've done. It's always been sort of part of my job, and I've always done other things too. Because if you're in an ad agency and you've got a science background, that's kind of unusual. So people will hook you in whenever they see something that they don't understand or that requires a sort of technical mindset to engage with it. But it's always sort of fascinated me, and it's, in my free time I read about it, I think about it. It's sort of a big focus. And so when we started Among Equals, we didn't want to just be a sustainability agency because it's very easy to get pigeonholed. The sad truth
Yeah.
is that if you do sustainability work, people won't let you do a brand for their new beer or something like that. But if you do a brand for people's beer, or you help them sell things, nothing that makes the world a worse place. We're very clear about that. But if you do that kind of work, you're then allowed still to do sustainability communications work, if that makes sense. You don't get pigeonholed.
Right.
Uh,
Okay.
and so I came into it because I was frustrated with how the climate movement was presenting itself. And then I came into the agency world and found a lot of people weren't being as scientific as I had expected either in terms of how they approach comms. But there was still lots and lots of knowledge that then and now is not really being applied to climate comms, which are quite bad. And so I've spent the last 4.5 years focused on the agency, not thinking about climate comms, sort of hoping it was getting better, assuming it was getting better. And then I've started talking to people again when I've had the time to put my head above the parapet and we're not just working day to day on the business, and found it really hasn't changed since 4.5 years ago. Or there have been incremental improvements, but by and large, climate communications is still a discipline that is not terribly well informed by either scientists from the ad and brand world or tons and tons of research which is being done in psychology and behavioral economics and disciplines like that. So the agency is a sort of commercial agency with a sustainability bent, but we just launched a new offer all around sort of using behavioral change and psychology around good causes because we're just seeing not enough of it being done, leveraging that insight to be effective, I guess.
Okay. And so, how do we fix climate communications? What's missing from there, and what do we need to do to fix that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's really, 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 that's a big question, but climate is psychologically complicated, right? And I think that's probably a lot of you'll know that, a lot of your listeners will know that, but
Mm.
we don't always take that into account when we do comms. In fact, I think we rarely do. In the sustainability communications world, there's an awareness of eco anxiety now, for sure. People talk
Yep.
about that, but the fundamental psychology of climate change, like how we can actually engage with it as people, doesn't seem to be talked about that much. Or if it is, it's not thought about or applied. I, you should go all the way back to our sort of ancient ancestors. I don't want to get too much into evolutionary psychology because some people question aspects of it, and I'm not a big expert in evolutionary psychology, but it makes a lot of sense to think we evolved in a world where we had to deal with like short-term crises, urgent things. That tiger or that saber-toothed tiger or whatever is going to eat me, or I'm going to starve tonight. And we're quite good at dealing with that kind of urgent, acute crisis, but we don't seem very psychologically good. And whether it's because of those ancient ancestors or something else, we're not very good at this sort of slow, big crisis. And if you look at the sort of climate stuff or sustainability stuff where people have actually acted quite a lot quite quickly, or at least mindsets have shifted a lot, it's stuff that's felt acute. So if you think about the sort of the ozone crisis, it was something, quite a few years ago now, but it kind of felt, oh my God, this is urgent right now. This is happening right now. We need to solve it
Yeah.
right now. And if you look at the plastics panic, what are we, sort of 2017, maybe? Obviously, that had been building for a long time, and scientists have been saying, oh, there's a bit of a problem here. We've got a lot of plastic building up in the oceans. Suddenly, it jumped into the public awareness in a space of sort of 6, 8 months. It went from being something the public weren't aware of to something that suddenly a lot of people were aware of, thanks to Blue Planet, thanks to all kinds of things. And it felt like an acute crisis. Now, the actions that came out of that weren't actually very effective. We haven't seen a huge drop in people, but there was an atmosphere suddenly where people wanted to drive change and people were talking about it. And I think that was because it felt like an acute moment of crisis, which was sort of good. Oh my God, this is happening right now. We need to solve it right now. And that's something that for the wider climate change, it's the opposite of that. I mean, Timothy
Mm.
Morton, the sort of philosopher, talks about it as a hyper object. And I haven't read their work recently, so I'm probably going to get some of this wrong. But the idea is it's something, climate change is something so big and all encompassing that it's literally beyond comprehension because it's kind of everywhere all at once, affecting everything. So we have this thing that we're potentially psychologically quite ill equipped to engage with on the one hand. And on the other hand, we have an industry, a communications, maybe industry is the wrong word, but we have an ecosystem of climate communicators who are, for the most part, political progressives. Uh, as am I, your politics, but if you care
Yeah.
about the climate these days, you're probably a progressive. And so when dealing with this issue that people, I think, inherently find hard to engage with, we have approached it with a very aggressive mindset, which is fine, except that, 40, 50, 60% of the public in most democracies don't have that mindset. And so we've got a sort of communications complex that is creating, and there's NGOs in this, there's businesses in this, there's creating comms that can only really be engaging to 40 something percent of the population at best, and are
Mm.
potentially actively off-putting to others because they're framed in a highly progressive way, which is just not one that resonates with a lot of people. So we need to fix that. And then finally, there is this body of work that psychologists have done, behavioral economists have done, that exists within marketing for what's effective and not. And climate communicators don't seem to engage with it to the point where basics of sort of marketing practice, one of the most fundamental basics is to start with your audience, right? Understand them and build communications that talk to them. But in climate comms, it's more like understand the people who already care about the issue and talk to them. So much of the comms is preaching to the choir, and it's sort of
Mm.
almost set up inherently like that. And it's a big problem because I think that climate is fundamentally a sort of climate change is a people problem. And I don't mean that there's too many people or that it's an individual responsibility. It's not, it's a systemic problem that requires systemic
Yeah.
solutions. But in sort of democracies, we're not going to get those systemic solutions, if there isn't voter pressure. And so far, we're in a situation where 80 something percent of people in the UK, it's a lower but similar figure in the US. And I think you'll find a similar figure between 60 and 80 something percent of people across the sort of democratic world are concerned about climate change. But no one's really voting that in. You have Trump, a man who is avowedly going to dismantle climate agreements or pull out of them.
Mhm.
But an electorate in the US that actually is, concerned, if you survey them, about climate change. But we just haven't framed any of it in a way that really speaks to people's day-to-day priorities. The classic image of a polar bear. We all feel sad when we see the sad polar bear on the iceberg, but it's very distant from the average person psychologically. There's a phenomenon called psychological distance, which is how close or far we feel from a topic or an issue. And the closer we feel, the more likely we're actually to do something about it. And it has a few different aspects. There's a temporal aspect. Is it happening now or is it happening in the future? There's a sort of geographical or spatial aspect. Is it close to me or far away? There's a social aspect. Is this happening to people I know? And then there's a sort of hypotheticality. Might it not happen? And when we look at the polar bear on an iceberg, he lives a long way away from me. I don't socialize with many polar bears. His ice is maybe melting, maybe not. I don't know. So, that polar bear is great for making me feel bad for a minute and great for making me sympathize. You want me to sympathize and donate a bit of money for that polar bear to be happy? Absolutely. But you want me to change my life because this polar bear who I've never met is having a bad time? That's kind of a different proposition. And so we have this gap between concern that is quite high as people survey it and action, which we know is really not enough. And by action, I do mean stuff like voting. I do mean that systemic action as well as individual action. So, I think that was a pretty long and rambling answer, but hopefully I kind of addressed your question there.
Well, let's take a step back because you've kind of touched on one of the big issues around climate, and that is that it has become a very polarized topic. I mean, back in the 80s when the Montreal Protocol was passed for ozone that you talked about, climate it wasn't talked about as much, but politically it wasn't polarized at all. I mean, it was a bipartisan issue in the US, whereas now it's completely polarized. So, A, why? And B, is that something we can fix?
Well, I hope so. I mean, otherwise, you might say we're in trouble already, but we'll be really bad. So, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. In 91, 92, 78% of Americans identified as environmentalists. And that was, it was 50-50 across Republicans and Democrats. 2016, total percentage was something like 40%. Democrats were twice as likely to say they're environmentalists as Republicans. That was 2016. I don't know what the figure will be like now, but I'm sure it's worse. George Bush Sr., one of the major parts of his platform for his first, I think it was his first election, was solving global warming. And then, a couple of years in, the lobbying from the oil companies is really looking quite persuasive and no one's really putting any pressure on me. So maybe we can just kick this into the long weeds. And then since then, it's become this, as you say, this politicized issue. And this sort of leans back to comes back to the thing I was saying before about the fact that we have framed it in progressive terms, or perhaps more point, we've failed to frame it in sort of conservative terms as well. So there's a few reasons for that. But first, what does that look like? So there's a guy called Lakoff, George Lakoff. I mean, a guy, he's a leading cognitive linguist, probably in his 80s or something. He's not just a guy, who's written a bunch of fascinating books about mostly US politics, but also climate. And one of his sort of theses is that we have a sort of fundamental frame through which we understand the world. And there's a right-wing conservative frame and a left-wing progressive frame. And, its sort of fundamental progressive frame, is engaged by and persuaded by things like the collective good and the sort of common future and sort of ideas like that, ideas which are woven through all of our climate comms today, versus a conservative mindset, which is more driven by patriotism and protecting what we currently have. Little C conservative, letting us protect what we have and sort of defending purity and the sort of more moral driven rather than outcome driven of the world. You could almost think of it as sort of a morality driven worldview versus a sort of consequentialist outcome driven worldview. And we've failed for, I guess 20 something, 30 something, 40, I don't know, quite a long time now to really, not just climate comms, but particularly climate comms, to frame it through that right-wing conservative frame. And there's no reason why it shouldn't have been framed like that and couldn't be framed like that going forwards. It is not a stretch to frame fighting climate change as a patriotic act. It is not a stretch to say that we're sort of defending the purity of our ecosystem when we talk about climate change. And at the last US election, although it didn't work out, and actually a little bit before that, we have started to see the Democrats a little bit use some of that language in their climate communications. So Biden was talking a bit about, when he brought in various big legislative things that after the pandemic that included significant funding in sort of eco stuff, it was framed in a more patriotic way than has been traditional. And so there are small changes there, but there's a big problem, which is that I think on this issue, as with quite a few others, progressives would rather look good in front of other progressives than actually make a change. That might be a little bit unfair. There is a fear of being criticized by other progressives. That means that what you need to do is probably put stuff out there that things like you and me and people who listen to your podcast don't find very appealing. It might even make us feel a little bit uncomfortable. But that's what we will need to do to be effective. We need to drape climate action in the flag. We need to tap into, I don't know, Churchill and Reagan and that kind of thing to get people to care about it, to reach beyond the converted, because so much communications, it fails in other ways too, probably. But the first failure is that it's preaching to the choir, always. And so that we're never going to get the political consensus that we need, the action that we need, whilst we are only talking to 30-something% of the population who are already worried and would already like to change. Thank you.
Yeah, no point in, as you say, preaching to the converted. So we got to tell them that fixing climate will mean that no woman will ever want an abortion.
I mean, hopefully we can find something that isn't quite. But yeah, I mean, we need to engage with the arguments that are appealing to people we may not agree with. And this is sort of what I was talking about with in climate comms. It has been forgotten. One of the first basic principles of marketing, which is to understand your audience, and the audience is more than just climate people. But yeah, so hopefully not. If we fix climate change, no one will ever want an abortion again. But I hope
No,
we do need to engage.
That was me being facetious, obviously, but obviously,
yeah, no, absolutely.
Looking back on the American election, apparently one of the big trigger issues was the economy. So maybe we say fixing climate helps fix the economy because, you won't have that many climate disasters which cost hundreds of billions to fix.
Yeah, and so absolutely. I think an economic argument around climate has been made, but it's been highly academic. There's the sort of ecosystem services discourse. I think it's called something slightly different now, but it's the same idea. It's what's the financial value, and that's great. It's important work, but it's incredibly difficult to understand. And I think the economy is a brilliant parallel because no one really understands the economy. Voters, as a general rule, don't understand economics. I mean, I've studied economics, and I don't understand it. That's for sure. So, voters don't necessarily understand it, but you're absolutely right. The recent US election was definitely driven by that. And the feeling that people had that they were suffering economically, and Trump was taking that seriously. He was saying, I'm going to shake things up. And the Democrats weren't saying that. So, smarter people than I will have done a better diagnosis of what's led to Trump's coming in. But the economy is a good example. So people don't really understand it. But it's in the top 2 or 3 or 4 issues at any given election is perceived economic competence of the person that they voted in, even though people don't really understand it. And in climate, I think people have moved on a little bit, but for decades, the effort was, can we make people understand climate change? Well, people don't understand the economy, but they understand that it matters for their lives. So they go and vote for it. And so we don't need to say, mathematically, this is what climate means for the economy. We need people to understand that climate change is going to impact their lives in the same negative way that a poor economy does, and that solving it will impact their lives in a positive way, in the same way that a sort of positive economy will. And we need people to understand that argument sort of emotionally and feel that personal relevance this is going to get you. So that, yes, an economic argument is part of it, but more like we need to think about how successful politicians frame arguments around the economy, which is we're going to make it better. And these are the bits of the economy that actually matter to you. And take that lesson that no one understands that their economics, but they still go and vote for whoever they think is going to do a good job in the economy. And so we need to get climate change up there and stop trying to make people understand it and try and make people feel that it matters in the same way as the economy does, if that makes sense.
What about the usage of very simplistic messages? Almost to your point, I have two examples I'm thinking of. Get Brexit done, 3-word slogan, massively successful, won Boris the 2020 election. And the other one, which is kind of on the other side of the argument around climate, is just stop oil. And again, very simple, 3-word slogan. Obviously, you can't just stop oil. Obviously, you can't just get Brexit done. But those two have encapsulated messages. To your point, no one understands the economy. So let's fix the economy. That kind of slogan for politicians. Let's stop oil isn't one that moves the Overton window too far, and it doesn't bring in the kind of right-leaning people that you're saying we need to address. So, but is that the kind of messaging, the kind of simplistic 3-word slogan motif for bringing people in?
That certainly has to be part of it. Just stop oil, I think it's a good slogan. Like, you can't argue with that. Has it achieved a great deal of success? I'm not sure that it has, because I do think it's still, the whole movement is coming from that same crisis activist left wing kind of feeling, which doesn't really sit comfortably with not just conservatives, but an awful lot of people. But, yes, I mean, get Brexit done was great because it also spoke to people. Everyone was sick. Even progressives were sick of the sort of endless. I mean, I would have much rather we stayed in, but everyone was sick of this sort of endless discussion. And the promise was, we're going to stop having to talk about and hear about this thing every day. You can stop having to think about this tedious thing all the time. Now, obviously, we got to stop thinking about that tedious thing, and in the UK, it hasn't been great. Even people who voted out now agree that it was not great. But that slogan promised relief from pain, almost. This sort of existential, are we in, are we out, what's happening, this endless crisis negotiations. There was an argument made when Biden originally got in that part of what he was promising, not explicitly necessarily, but implicitly, was you had to hear less about politics for a while, because Trump was so noisy. And, that visibility is always good. People are more likely to pick for things they've heard of, but he felt very noisy all the time in the US. And, there was an argument made that part of Biden's original appeal was, maybe we don't have to hear about this so much. Whether that was true or not, I don't know, but certainly forget Brexit done. Like, absolutely, I don't want to hear about that anymore. So it was a short, pithy slogan, but it also spoke to how a bunch of people were thinking. And just stop oil is good because it implies action. And I think in the sort of outside of the eco sphere, there's not a feeling that environmentalists whinge a lot and talk a lot and don't necessarily get things done. But it has been framed in a way, and the activists have acted in a way, as with Extinction Rebellion, as with that, is deeply appealing to a group, but doesn't seem to have managed to translate into mainstream appeal or mainstream, I should accept this inconvenience on my life. I need, because it's worth it, because this is big enough, this is important enough in real terms, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I think we need those slogans, but we need more than that.
So we need to make it relevant to people's daily lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And so part of that is, yes, because look, if it's not relevant to my daily life and you're telling me that, or I understand that this is going to make things more expensive or more difficult, or I'm not going to have the things that I have today, yeah, you've got to show that it's relevant to my daily life if I'm going to do those things. The polar bear over there is not enough. There's lots and lots of research that says that a more sustainable life will be a healthier life and a happier life for people. Lots of research says that, and I believe that. But people are used to a life with cars. They're used to a life with a high level of consumption, and telling people they can't have those things, but they will be happier, that doesn't sound right. I mean, obviously, we know it probably is right, but it doesn't sound right to people. So climate sounds like sacrifice. Climate action sounds like I'm going to do less. And people don't like to do less as things are now. So yeah, we have to show that it's relevant to life. Yes, we've got to show them that they'll be happier too. But people think that there's a sacrifice inherent to it. People think that a more sustainable household cleaning product is probably less effective than the good old fashioned horrible bleach. When they have a baby and they start worrying about, is it safe around my child, then they're like, oh, maybe I'll get some eco cleaning products. But even today, after sort of 10, 15 years of people like Method and Ecova and other brands like that, there's still a lot of consumers have this, oh, is it really going to clean properly, or do I want some proper old bleach that's really going to deal with it? There is belief that climate action will mean settling for less than I have now, right? And so we need to solve that, but God, we need to make it relevant. We need to show people, like, yeah, this problem is relevant to your day-to-day life. Obama's speechwriter said the average American thinks about politics for 4 minutes a week. And I don't know if that was based on research or if it was just something, a bit of received wisdom. But, I think that's probably broadly true. And I think for climate, it's like 2 minutes a week. And so, people might be concerned, but are they concerned on the same level that what's going to be on the table for dinner tomorrow? Gosh, I need to pick up the kids from school. The energy bill's expensive right now. I'm feeling the pinch. All of these different things, even before we had this sort of last couple of years of high level of inflation and people feeling the pinch, those are just more pressing. And so we need to bring things down to a level and a scale, as well as framing them differently, both in terms of the impacts, but also the action that individuals feel like are directly relevant to them, and also a scale that they might have agency to actually do something meaningful about. If we think of how we frame climate change over the years, to sort of believe in and understand, maybe understand came first. And then there was a sort of urgency thing. Gosh, we need people to understand it's urgent. And there's been a sort of counter push to that by, we need climate positivity. We need to talk about what's good. And none of these things is the whole answer. In fact, all of them are only a small part of the answer. We probably need to be negative sometimes and positive other times. But all of the time, what we have failed to do is say, this is your day-to-day life. This is on a scale that you can engage with both the problems and the solutions, whether we're being scary or whether we're being joyful or whether we're trying to educate. And we know that education isn't enough. We know that that people's actions are more likely to be driven by social norms and the things around them than they are to be driven by additional knowledge. So we need to look at what are those norms, look at those things that are in your day-to-day life, and can we bring climate down to them? And there's a whole body of research by psychologists, by behavioral change professionals, by cognitive linguists that looks at exactly that. And it tends to be very specific. It isn't necessarily easy to go and apply those lessons straight away into climate comms because academic literature tends to be very specific. We've looked at such and such people in a specific country on a very specific question. But there are still actionable insights in it, things that we can translate to help us bring it down to people's day-to-day life. There's a bunch of work, I talked about some length psychological distance earlier. And now there's some argument saying that, well, psychological distance for climate change might not be so far off for some people, maybe because we're beginning to feel the effects. But there's a whole literature out there about how to reduce psychological distance in communications. There's a whole literature out there in terms of how to make something sort of socially normal so that people are more likely to engage with it. And some of this is really simple and can be applied directly. Let's take a very, very practical example. There was an experiment in Stanford University 6, 7, maybe 8 years ago, and they were looking at ways to get people to make more environmentally food choices in their canteen. Pick the plant-based option, not the meat-based option. And if you put a poster up that says, near the food, oh, it's better for the environment to choose the plant-based option, it doesn't really change what anyone does. And you can put loads of facts up there. And it might change a couple of people, but it doesn't have a really dramatic impact. If you put a poster up there that says more and more people in this canteen are choosing the plant-based option, and then you can say because of the environmental things, that drives a change because people are, oh, people like me are doing this thing. People like me are concerned about this thing. So I should be concerned about this thing. So I should do this thing. It takes it down to a level, well, I'm not fighting climate change when I eat this steak or this, cauliflower steak. I'm not personally, that's far away. But if people like me are doing it, more and more of them, then maybe I should do that too. Because whenever we're not sure, whenever we're in a social situation where we're not really sure what we should be doing, which is a lot of the time really, we look to those norms. We look to what others around us are doing. When we walk into a library, we don't need to be told to be quiet. We know we should be quiet because it's a social norm. And so much of the time, we fall back on those norms. And as communicators, we can tap into them, and we could do that around climate. But instead, we've got climate action is pretty unnormal. Who's doing it? It's like Leonardo DiCaprio and Al Gore and Greta Thunberg, and those people might be admirable. I'm not saying, but they're not day to day relatable for most people. They're not setting a norm for most people. So yeah, there's a whole literature for bringing it down and putting it in people's personal lives, and it's not easy, but it is there. And so this is sort of what I'm saying. Climate communicators need to try harder. They need to go and read that stuff.
So
Yeah,
giving people practical examples like it's going to affect the price and quality of your beer or your wine or your coffee or your olive oil or any of these things that you use day to day.
absolutely. And I mean, it's tricky because climate change is huge and those things are small. And so
Mm.
the temptation is to do sort of big communications. This is a global issue. We need global solutions. And we do, and it is. But if we talk to people, then communicators have to get specific and they have to tie down what is this audience member into. There was a study, I think it was in the US, looking at birds, bird watchers. And if you say this local bird, this one that you're used to seeing, is going to be endangered, there's going to be fewer of those in the next 10 years. That hits people way harder and they changes their opinion and changes their sort of stated preparedness to act far more than the global big picture stuff because it's relatable, it's right there. And yeah, chocolate could become unaffordable, coffee could become unaffordable for most people, these could become niche specialist products, and these are things that people do care about. And there are other ways that are, when the Pope talked about climate change, he tapped into Christian sort of symbols and language around climate change. The concept of Christian stewardship, the idea, I'm not a Christian and my Bible reading is a long time behind me, but there's an idea of stewardship
Mm.
in Christianity, the idea that sort of God gave Christians the earth to look after, to have a sense of responsibility for. And the Pope was able to tap into that language. And sure enough, you sort of survey people before and after that speech who are in that Catholic community, they cared. And that wasn't because necessarily it's going to be your direct personal life, but it was made relevant through being framed in a way that was deeply relevant to them personally. It was a way that it was to do with their outlook on the world. And so there is stuff absolutely right. We need to talk to people about your coffee, your beer, your day-to-day products that you consume are going to be worse, more expensive, harder to get. But there's also just fundamentally framing things through people's worldviews or in ways that speak to people's worldviews rather than here's this big global issue.
And do we need to change the language we use when we're talking to people as well about climate?
Yes. I mean, there's been a big focus on that, but in the wrong ways. So 2019, I think it was, The Guardian started talking about the climate crisis instead of climate change. And that was one of a number of sort of progressive groups that, for all the right reasons, said we need to stop talking about climate change and we need to start talking about the climate crisis because it's urgent now. We need people to understand that it's urgent and act on it.
Mm.
Now, and this is a great example. If people had gone and engaged with the academic literature, they would see that this sort of crisis framing has been tried with other issues, and it's at best a double-edged sword. If you have a crisis but it keeps rolling on for several years, I stop believing in it.
Mm.
Crisis is something that happens and we solve it, or if it keeps going, is it a crisis? Two, it can be very off-putting. If something is too negative and you're not giving me a solution pretty easily, maybe I just don't engage with the thing at all. There have been various efforts to reform the language, but they've been informed by calling it the climate crisis went down really, really well with progressives. Yeah, now people are going to
Yeah.
get how urgent this is. Now we're going to see the change. But there was no evidence really that that was a good move. And I think lo and behold, within a couple of years, there had been studies that showed it wasn't a successful reframe. Like that reframing hadn't done anything to shift people's thinking. And in common with other attempts to use crisis framing to solve issues. And so we absolutely need to look at the language that we use. We need to look at the imagery we use, look at the language we use. We need to look at the sort of fundamental semiotic of how we frame the whole thing. So who's delivering the message? But we have to, one, understand our audience first, two, get specific about what it is we actually want to talk to them about, because it probably isn't the whole of climate change all at once. And then three, when we've got that in mind, then go and find evidence-based approaches to do that, whether that's from marketing and branding, whether that's from academia. But you've only got to find those kind of solutions once you've said, okay, who is the actual audience and what specifically do I need to talk to them about? And ideally, what specifically do I need them to do differently as having seen this come? Because I'd say another part of it is just, we're just pushing angst out into the world, right? Even the people who are getting engaged, an awful lot of climate comms is just very anxiety inducing. Give people something to do, or don't make them feel anxious, probably. Otherwise, you're just going to create disengagement.
Yeah, no, that's one of the reasons I set up the podcast, was because, as I say, there's a huge amount of news out there about climate, and 99% of it or more is negative or scary or tragic, as we saw last year in Valencia with the floods, or, et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to create a space where I was highlighting some of the good work that's been doing in the space, so that I could educate people on strategies that are working, hopefully inspire some more people to act, and then B, rather selfishly, I was making sure that I was hearing at least one good news story in the climate space every week, so I wasn't ending up in a fetal position on the floor crying my eyes out. So, yeah, no, I can see that's important. Listen, Ollie, for people who are listening, who, maybe aspiring communicators, what's the kind of top piece of advice you could give to them so that they could make a difference in climate action?
I mean, take a step back and understand that if you want to talk about these things, you're probably not the audience. I mean, you're definitely not the audience.
Hmm.
It's true for all sorts of issues, but you're far closer to it than the audience is or ever will be. So the first thing you need to do is take a step back and actually honestly say, who is the audience? Who do I actually need to engage and persuade? Because it's not you, and you have to accept that the thing that might be most effective is not the thing that you would actually like personally to put out into the world. Obviously, don't compromise your values. Don't say stuff that you think is bad, but you've got to take that step back and be open to the fact that the solution might not be one that you find personally appealing. And then you've got to go and do the research. You've got to go and read, and it's boring, some of it, because you've got to filter through a bunch of academic papers or a bunch of books. But also, just be honest. Apply common sense in a way that we seem not to be able to do. We all know, if we're in a restaurant or in a pub or in a supermarket, the kind of things we have to say to persuade people. We all know how to do that. Persuade people we don't like or we don't get along with. And we know that we sort of, I don't want to say compromise our truth, that sounds bigger, but we know that we put an edited version of our message to those people out in the real world to get what we want. And we need to do that as a climate movement and as a progressive movement more generally, probably. So my one principle is take a step back, understand who it actually is, and then go read about it, go understand it, go talk to some of those people, go engage with the media that they engage with, and think about how you can put your message in their terms. Because if we don't do that, you want to hear good news stories. And I mean, the good news is we can do this. There's evidence out there for how to do it. But if we don't do that, we don't have a good news story. We've got a bad news story. Um,
Left field question, Ollie. If you could have any person or character, alive or dead, real or fictional, as kind of an example for successful climate communication, who would it be and why?
that is so well. So I mean, if I could have someone be a climate communicator, I mean, I might pick Churchill, actually. Like, hugely controversial figure in many ways. Not a
Yeah.
nice man, almost certainly.
Hmm.
I mean, pretty dark history on the colonialism side of things,
Yeah.
but hugely effective communicator to a mass audience in a time of crisis. And that's the kind of thing. We actually created a brand for an environmental sort of movement to try and pass some environmental laws in the UK. And one of the things we looked at was Churchill's speeches. And they ended up using the graphics we created. They didn't end up using that much of that language. But I genuinely think it would have been very effective because it's language of struggle. It's language of like, things aren't necessarily going to be great right now, but they are going to get better. And we have to do this thing and it's important. I mean, it's language of pragmatic hope, language of
Hmm.
sort of
Yep.
determination. And I think we could definitely use all of those things in the climate message, and we could use that, conservative frame that he brought. Not saying he's a good person or anything, or was a good person, obviously. But I think he would have been a brilliant climate communicator because of those traits and because of that ability to engage people around tough
Nice.
calls.
Yeah. Yeah. No, very true. Very true. We have to fight them on the beaches, apparently. So, okay, good.
Fight them for the
we
beaches, otherwise they'll wash away.
Fair point. Fair point. Yep. We're coming towards the end of the podcast now, Ollie. Is there any question I didn't ask that you wish I did, or any aspect of this we haven't touched on that you think it's important for people to be aware of?
I think it's important that people are aware this is a self-inflicted failure of climate communications. We have done this to ourselves, probably through wishing for the best and positive ideology. We have done this to ourselves. And obviously, making climate communications better is not going to solve everything. And there's sort of people in the ad industry who think if we can make ads sort of climate conscious, that will change everything. And I don't have the ego to think, it's a small part of the solution. But we've known about climate change in one form or another since, latest the 50s, and latest the hard science, I guess the 70s to really, really know. And we've had an awful lot of the technologies since then. So I genuinely do think that there is a need to persuade. We're inventing new tech. We're refining the science, and this is important and helpful and useful, and we need it. But if we can't persuade the majority of people that they need real change really quite soon, none of that tech is going to really matter that much. And so I think it is a people problem, and the failures have mostly been self-inflicted. And so I would say, if you talk to people in any form about the climate, take a step back and say, am I actually doing this the most effective way possible, or am I doing this in a way that's going to appeal to other people who already like me? Because I do think it is self-inflicted, but for the right reasons. I don't want to get a bunch of people angry. I'm not saying climate communicators are bad or even bad at their jobs. And there's loads of people out there doing good work, but there's just not enough of it. It's not the norm necessarily.
Ollie, if people would like to know more about yourself or any of the things we discussed in the podcast today, where would you have me direct them?
So there isn't a great deal on our website because, as I said, for the last 4.5 years, we've really been focused on just running our business. But there will in the future be more, or at least links from amongequals.co. Climate stuff, we do a lot of work with startups and all kinds of work. Sustainability is just a small area of our work. I will be posting more about it on LinkedIn, but honestly, I would say just go out and read. I have made part of my career around translating the insights of psychology and behavioral change into communications and campaign stuff. But there's lots of other people doing that. Go engage with the original stuff. The British Psychological Association puts out a newsletter every couple of weeks, which is full of fascinating stuff. It's not always about climate, it's about all kinds of stuff. But there's all kinds of people out there putting psychological and other forms of research into more digestible formats. Go and engage with that. Sure, follow me. Sure, send me a message if you want to have to talk about any of this stuff. Absolutely, I find it fascinating. But there's loads of content out there. It's just people need to actually go and read it. And they don't currently because it's boring, it's technical. It's just not something they think to look at. So go do that. And then if you want to come talk to me, sure.
Ollie, that's been fascinating. Thanks a million for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me, Tom. It's been a pleasure.